The story of the P-51 Mustang begins long before it ever roared across the skies of Europe. It starts in 1940, with a war already raging and the world uncertain about who would ultimately control the air. The British, desperate for modern fighters, approached North American aviation with a request: build licensed P-40 Warhawks for the Royal Air Force. Instead, the engineers at North American Counter proposed something entirely new: an aircraft designed from scratch, faster, sleeker, and more future-proof than anything flying at the time. They promised to design it in 120 days. They delivered it even faster. What emerged on the drawing board was a fighter unlike its predecessors. It had a laminar flow wing, an innovation that reduced drag across much of the airfoil, and an aerodynamic fuselage shaped to cut through the air with remarkable efficiency. The prototype, NA-73X, rolled out in September 1940. Its first flights revealed a machine with excellent handling characteristics and a potential that engineers could see but hadn't yet fully unlocked. Initially, the RAF received early versions of the Mustang equipped with the Allison 51710 engine. At low altitudes, these aircraft were swift, agile, and ideal for tactical reconnaissance and ground attack. But as the British tested the Mustang's airframe further, one truth became impossible to ignore. The aircraft desperately needed a high-altitude engine to reach its real potential. The war in Europe was being fought at 25,000 feet and above. Without power in that realm, no fighter could hope to dominate the air. The breakthrough came with an idea that seemed almost too bold: the British proposal to combine the American airframe with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Engineers on both sides of the Atlantic recognized exactly what this could mean. The Merlin was a master of high-altitude performance, giving Spitfires and Lancasters extraordinary power where the Allison fell off sharply. When the first Merlin-powered Mustang prototypes flew in 1942, the results surpassed even the most optimistic expectations. Suddenly, the Mustang wasn't just good, it was exceptional. With the Merlin engine installed, the aircraft's transformation was complete. The P-51B and later the P-51D emerged as machines capable of reaching altitudes over 40,000 feet, cruising faster and farther than any Allied fighter before them. Its diving speed was unmatched, its agility was razor-sharp, its stability at high altitude made it a perfect platform for both attack and escort. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns armed the wings, delivering firepower able to rip apart enemy fighters and strafe ground targets with devastating effect. Yet what truly elevated the P-51 from a great fighter to a war-winning weapon was its range. With drop tanks and an efficient engine, it could escort American B-17 and B-24 deep into the heart of Germany and back, something no earlier Allied fighter had managed consistently. Before the Mustang, bomber crews faced horrific loss rates on long missions. Once the P-51 arrived in force during 1943 and 1944, the skies began to shift. Bomber formations suddenly had fast, aggressive guardians capable of hunting German fighters anywhere they appeared. The Luftwaffe quickly recognized this new threat. Their experienced pilots, once used to cutting through bomber screens with alarming ease, now faced a fighter that could climb with them, dive with them, and stay on their tails longer than anything they had fought before. Veteran Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland famously summarized the change in one sentence: the P-51 was the most dangerous Allied fighter in the war. Pilots who flew the Mustang spoke about it with a reverence normally reserved for living legends. They praised its responsiveness, describing how the aircraft seemed to anticipate the pilot's intentions. They admired its ruggedness. Mustangs often returned home riddled with holes, yet still controllable. But above all, they valued its ability to take them deeper into enemy territory and bring them back alive. By the winter of 1944, the P-51 had become the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Force's escort groups. Its silhouette, long nose, bubble canopy, broad wings, became a symbol of American reach and resilience. Squadrons pushed east into occupied Europe as Allied armies advanced on the ground, turning captured fields into forward operating bases. This growing network of airstrips allowed the P-51 to remain constantly in the fight, meeting the German aircraft wherever they rose. As the Mustang expanded its presence, the Luftwaffe shrank in the face of spiraling losses. The German Air Force still fought fiercely, especially during the bitter cold months of late 1944, but it no longer enjoyed the numerical or qualitative advantage it once held. The presence of Mustang escorts meant that any German fighter attempting to attack Allied bombers risked being ambushed from above or behind. The skies that had once been the Luftwaffe's domain slowly transformed into Allied territory. The Mustang's arrival also reshaped Allied strategy. Commanders now dared to send bombers to more dangerous targets: oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, transportation hubs, and aircraft factories deep within the Reich. These raids, once unthinkable due to heavy losses, now became routine. Each mission carried enormous weight, destroying German fuel production, strangled panzer divisions, and grounded aircraft. Disrupting transport networks delayed reinforcements and supplies. By enabling such missions, the P-51 accelerated the collapse of German logistics and crippled its ability to continue the fight. By late 1944, Allied leaders understood that the P-51 was more than a tool. It was the spearhead of an air power revolution. And as 1945 approached, its role grew even more urgent. The Luftwaffe, cornered and desperate, prepared one last grand attack to reverse the tide. Their plan, ambitious and risky, aimed to strike Allied airfields at dawn on New Year's Day. It was an operation crafted to shock the Allies, disrupt air superiority, and perhaps buy time for German armies on the ground. The P-51 would be at the heart of the response to that desperate strike. Its pilots, seasoned by years of combat and armed with one of the most effective fighters of the war, stood ready for the storm that was coming. And that storm would arrive at an airfield designated Y-29, where the legend of the P-51 would be written in smoke, steel, and winter sky. The winter of 1944 settled over Western Europe with a bitterness that matched the strategic tension rising across the continent. Snow lay in thick sheets across Belgium and the Netherlands, muffling the sound of distant artillery and turning country roads into icy traps. Allied forces pushed eastward after liberating France, yet the war felt far from won. The skies, once a place of decisive engagement, became unpredictable with each passing week. Low clouds, freezing rain, and continuous fog created an atmosphere where danger could appear or vanish without warning. For the Allied air commands, these conditions shaped every decision. Airfields carved from muddy Belgian fields were barely holding together under the weight of continuous operations. Crews fought the cold as fiercely as they fought the enemy. Fuel lines froze, engines refused to turn over, and ground crews labored through the nights under dim lamps to keep their aircraft functional at first light. The P-51 Mustang groups stationed across these temporary bases operated in this demanding environment, their presence growing more important as the ground battle intensified. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, which began in mid-December, caught many commanders off guard. What became known as the Battle of the Bulge sent shockwaves through Allied headquarters. German armored columns surged through dense forests and frozen ridges, creating a wedge in the Allied line and plunging multiple divisions into confusion. The sudden shift in momentum forced the Western Allies to reassess their assumptions about the enemy's remaining strength. Amid this turmoil, one truth resurfaced: air superiority remained the cornerstone of every Allied strategy. Through December, poor weather conditions hindered the full might of the Allied air forces. Aircraft were grounded for days at a time, unable to fly in snowstorms and thick fog. During those critical early days of the Bulge, German forces advanced under a protective sky free of Allied reconnaissance and attack aircraft. The Luftwaffe, sensing an opportunity, surged forward in a series of increasingly aggressive sorties. Their fighters struck supply lines, troop concentrations, and even attempted limited engagements with bomber formations when weather permitted. Yet these efforts revealed an underlying fragility within the Luftwaffe. Years of attrition had thinned their ranks. Many capable veterans were gone, replaced with inexperienced flyers, rushed through truncated training programs. Fuel shortages forced German pilots to ration flight hours, reducing the time they could spend sharpening their skills. Even so, the Luftwaffe leadership believed that one bold operation might restore an advantage long since lost to the Allies. As the Ardennes offensive faltered under growing Allied resistance, preparations began for an aerial strike designed to shake the entire Western Front. Allied commanders, meanwhile, took stock of their own situation. Despite their numerical and technological edge, forward-deployed squadrons faced new challenges. The rapid advance across France meant many fighter groups were now operating from hastily built airstrips, carved from frozen fields or reclaimed farmland. Ash Airfield, known to the Americans as Y-29, was one such location. Built only weeks before Christmas, Y-29 housed the 352nd Fighter Group's P-51 Mustangs and elements of the 366th Fighter Group's Thunderbolts. Its position placed it close to the front lines and squarely in the path of any German thrust across Belgium. Life on Y-29 mirrored the hard conditions of winter warfare. Pilots huddled inside small wooden huts or canvas tents, warming their hands over makeshift stoves before stepping into the icy wind for early sorties. Ground personnel prepared aircraft beneath a sky often filled with drifting snow. Engines needed careful coaxing to fire in the freezing temperatures, and even minor maintenance tasks required perseverance from crews who worked with numb fingers and frost-crusted tools. Yet morale remained strong. The Mustang pilots, many of whom had already flown deep escort missions into Germany earlier in the year, carried themselves with a quiet focus. The aircraft they flew inspired confidence even in the bleakest conditions. While the Allies concentrated on stabilizing the front and preparing for renewed offensives, the German High Command finalized its aerial plan. Operation Bodenplatte. Conceived as a coordinated blow against Allied airfields, the operation intended to eliminate as many fighters as possible on the ground. The plan depended on absolute surprise. German formations would fly at extremely low altitudes to evade radar and strike at dawn. Luftwaffe planners believed that by crippling the combat air patrols across Belgium and the Netherlands, they could help their struggling ground forces regain momentum. The choice of New Year's morning stemmed from both opportunity and desperation. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies for the first time in weeks, allowing German pilots the visibility needed for low-level navigation. At the same time, the holiday atmosphere hinted that Allied forces might be less alert. In reality, many Allied air units were still working through the night, repairing aircraft damaged by recent missions or rushing to complete maintenance before conditions worsened again. As the hours passed toward the end of December, subtle signs hinted at an approaching storm beyond the weather. Intelligence reports noted increased German aircraft activity east of the Rhine. Radar operators detected unusual patterns of movement near known Luftwaffe bases. Though no one yet saw the full picture, enough fragments emerged to create a sense of unease among certain commanders on the Allied side. One of those officers was Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group. With experience honed through countless missions, Meyer sensed a shift in the air. Something in the rhythm of operations hinted that the enemy was preparing something larger than scattered raids. Across the front, forces braced for the unpredictable. Allied units reorganized their positions as the Bulge offensive gradually slowed. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe formations gathered under cover of darkness, engines idling in the cold while pilots waited for the signal to launch. Their mission was ambitious: sweep across dozens of miles at treetop height, strike critical airfields, and cripple Allied air support at a moment when ground forces fought desperately in the snow-covered forests. As December turned to January, the tension in the air thickened. The weather finally cleared. The sky opened in a pale winter blue that stretched across Belgium. At Y-29, crew chiefs checked ammunition belts, refueled aircraft, and confirmed that each Mustang stood ready for the morning's operations. Pilots moved through their routines with practiced ease, unaware that the next sunrise would thrust them into one of the most dramatic aerial engagements of the war. The stage was set. The winter of 1944 held its breath, and somewhere to the east, German fighters were already gathering speed in the cold morning air, heading straight for the field where the P-51 Mustang would soon carve its place in history. In the final cold nights of December 1944, as Allied forces pushed stubbornly against the edges of the German Ardennes offensive, another plan was unfolding far behind enemy lines. quiet, dangerous, and conceived with the urgency of a cornered force. Operation Bodenplatte was more than a tactical strike. It was the Luftwaffe's attempt to reclaim the initiative in a war slipping beyond recovery. For Germany's air arm, this operation represented the belief that one decisive blow might fracture Allied momentum, disrupt air superiority, and give the Wehrmacht precious room to breathe in the snow-shrouded Ardennes. The groundwork had been laid weeks earlier, inside briefing rooms illuminated by dim lamps and clouded with cigarette smoke. Luftwaffe commanders gathered around maps spread across wooden tables, tracing out routes, identifying targets, and shaping a plan where timing mattered as much as accuracy. The objective was straightforward: strike Allied airfields at first light, cause havoc on the ground, and burn as many fighters as possible before they could take off. The clarity of the mission masked the complexity of its execution. To succeed, the attackers needed low-level flight precision, complete secrecy, and weather conditions that allowed navigation without exposing the formations to Allied radar. Hand-picked ground crews moved through December nights, preparing aircraft in near silence. Focke-Wulf FW-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s received fresh ammunition, full fuel loads, and last inspections. Engines were tested in brief bursts to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Pilots, some hardened by years of combat and others alarmingly inexperienced, memorized routes designed to carry them just above treetops. The operation demanded extreme discipline. Each formation would fly at altitudes that exposed them to every obstacle the winter landscape could present, from forest lines to factory chimneys. Despite the outward confidence of planners, the Luftwaffe faced challenges hidden by the urgency of the moment. Fuel was scarce, leaving pilots with limited time for training flights. Replacement airmen had little real combat experience and had flown only minimal hours on their aircraft. Yet these limitations did nothing to diminish the scale of Bodenplatte. Nearly 1,000 fighters from multiple wings across the Western Front were earmarked for the mission, an aerial armada intended to strike nearly every major Allied airfield in Belgium and the Netherlands in a single coordinated blow. Secrecy surrounded every preparation. Messages traveled through channels labeled with misleading codes to obscure their purpose. Some orders were delivered by hand to ensure no radio transmission would betray the operation. Even German ground units positioned along the flight paths received no warning. This omission, meant to preserve surprise, created an invisible hazard that would later contribute to the tragedy in the skies. While preparations advanced, Allied intelligence gathered fragments of information that suggested something significant was underway. Reconnaissance photos revealed larger-than-usual groupings of fighters at certain Luftwaffe bases. Ground agents reported unusual flight patterns and increased activity in previously quiet sectors. Yet the nature of Bodenplatte remained concealed enough that analysts struggled to assemble a coherent picture. As the final hours of the year slipped away, Allied commanders sensed the potential for an impending strike, but disagreed on its scale or purpose. Inside Luftwaffe airfields, tension expanded like a tide. Pilots attempted sleep but found it elusive. Many lay on cots staring at canvas ceilings, their minds drifting through memorized flight paths and calculations for time on target. Others paced the length of their barracks, absorbing the gravity of what awaited them. The aircrews understood that this mission required absolute precision. A slight deviation in heading or speed could send an entire formation off course. They also recognized the immense stakes. A successful operation offered hope, faint perhaps, yet hope remains powerful even when dim. In the early hours of New Year's Day, 1945, the first signal went out. Meteorological assessments confirmed what planners had prayed for. Clear skies stretched across much of western Germany. A biting wind swept over the runways, carrying with it the sharp scent of fuel and frost. Pilots suited up and gathered beside their aircraft as the sky still clung to its deep pre-dawn shade. Engine startup orders echoed across airstrips, and mechanics pulled chocks from wheels while propellers turned slow and heavy in the winter chill. Moments later, engines wound toward full power, creating a chorus of deep mechanical thunder. One after another, fighters rolled forward, their wheels leaving thin lines on snow-dusted runways before lifting into the frigid air. The departure of each formation followed a strict schedule. Timing errors could compromise the entire operation. Despite the meticulous planning, a sense of unpredictability hovered over every launch. Some wings managed smooth takeoffs, others struggled with frozen ground surfaces or last-minute mechanical issues. The unforgiving season made no concessions. Once airborne, German formations dropped to astonishingly low altitudes. Snow-covered fields, winding rivers, and dark forest edges passed beneath them in rapid blurs. Pilots faced the dual challenge of maintaining formation discipline and staying close enough to the ground to avoid detection. Any slight misjudgment risked contact with trees or farmhouses. Still, the fighters pressed forward, hugging terrain through valleys and past villages that remained unaware of the wave of aircraft skimming overhead. Thousands of feet above them, Allied radar stations struggled to read the low-flying fighters. At such altitudes, German aircraft blended into the landscape, appearing only momentarily on screens before vanishing again. Meanwhile, flares dropped by German night fighters illuminated the routes ahead, marking reference points for the attacking wings. These signals guided the formations toward their targets across Belgium and the Netherlands. Among those targets was Ash Airfield, known to its American occupants as Y-29. As the Luftwaffe crossed the front lines, an unexpected hazard emerged. Because so few German ground units had been briefed about the operation, anti-aircraft gunners in several locations opened fire on the very fighters meant to support them. Tracer rounds sliced through the early morning darkness, surprising both attackers and defenders. Smoke clouds rose as some aircraft succumbed to friendly fire, their last glide ending in forests or snow-covered fields. Even so, the surviving formations pressed westward. Every pilot understood the cost of slowing. Momentum was everything, and dawn crept steadily closer. Within minutes of reaching Belgium, the attacking groups prepared for the final stage of their approach. Airfields across the region lay still in the muted light of early morning. Many Allied pilots were busy with pre-flight routines or final checks for upcoming missions. Ground crews attended to battered aircraft from recent operations. At Y-29, the scene reflected that same sense of normalcy. Maintenance underway, pilots moving toward their Mustangs, morning chill settling into every corner of the field. Unbeknownst to the American airmen on that cold Belgian morning, dozens of German fighters were already barreling toward their position. The attacking force had aligned itself with precision, gained through weeks of planning. The sun crept low over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the icy fields. In that glow, the German fighters finally reached the outskirts of their target. The stage was ready. The final moments before impact stretched thin, holding a fragile stillness that would be shattered within seconds. The Luftwaffe approached Y-29 with engines roaring just above the tree line, poised to unleash the opening strike of Operation Bodenplatte, an assault that would ignite one of the most dramatic air battles of the war. The first morning of 1945 unfolded across Belgium with a brittle quiet. A thin frost clung to every surface at Ash Airfield, coating Mustang wings, fuel drums, and the wooden huts where pilots had spent the night. Y-29, carved only weeks earlier from cold soil and raw timber, had already endured storms, mud, and artillery rattling from the distant Ardennes. Yet on this clear morning, the field seemed almost peaceful, an illusion that would break within minutes. The men stationed here had no way of knowing that the largest aerial strike the Luftwaffe would launch on the Western Front since 1940 was racing toward them at treetop level. Before sunrise, the 352nd Fighter Group began preparing for a routine mission. Pilots filed into briefing rooms where lanterns illuminated maps and weather charts. Officers detailed expected routes and targets. Outside, ground crews worked quickly to thaw cockpit glass, prime engines, and load ammunition belts. Frost still clung stubbornly to wing roots and fuselage seams, even as fuel trucks rolled between aircraft, engines coughing awake one by one. Among the dozens of pilots readying themselves for the morning's sortie was Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, commander of the 487 Fighter Squadron. Known for his calm presence and sharp instincts, Meyer had spent the previous night uneasy. Intelligence summaries offered hints of enemy preparations. Rumors whispered through the tents about unusual Luftwaffe fuel allocations and increased fighter activity beyond the Rhine. Meyer sensed the edges of a threat, vague, unconfirmed, yet impossible to ignore. He approached the morning with that intuition in mind. With approval finally secured to place a flight on readiness at first light, Meyer ordered 12 Mustangs positioned at the edge of the runway, engines already warmed. Pilots strapped into their seats earlier than usual, oxygen masks ready and gloved hands resting on throttles. The atmosphere around the aircraft was strangely still, the kind of stillness that often precedes a sudden break in rhythm. Everything waited for a cue. The cue arrived at 9:20 a.m. A sound rolled in softly at first, a rumble like distant thunder. Pilots looked up. Ground crews paused mid-step, momentarily unsure whether the noise came from friendly aircraft or machinery somewhere across the field. The answer revealed itself seconds later when formation shapes appeared beyond the tree line, dark silhouettes speeding low across the horizon. Engines howled with ferocity as dozens of FW-190s and BF-109s surged toward Y-29. Their altitude was barely above the treetops, their guns already charged. The airfield erupted into motion. Warning shouts spread across the line at the same moment tracer fire streaked overhead. Explosions tore into the frozen ground, sending soil and debris flying. Within moments, the Luftwaffe attack swept over the airfield like a steel storm. German fighters opened the assault with strafing runs aimed at parked aircraft, fuel reserves, and maintenance crews. Smoke curled upward from the first hits, casting dark shapes against the pale winter sky. At the end of the runway, Meyer reacted with decisive speed. He thrust his throttle forward and barked orders to the other pilots waiting in their Mustangs. The 12 P-51s accelerated immediately, engines screaming as they raced down the snow-covered field. Flames erupted near the runway's edge from a strafing burst, yet the pilots held their nerve. For a moment, each Mustang seemed locked in a race against the incoming attack, chasing the sky before the next hail of gunfire reached them. As Meyer's wheels lifted from the ground, a Fokker-Wulf fighter swept across his path, banking sharply with the intention of tearing into the rising Mustangs. Meyer pulled the stick back, swung his gun sight across the enemy aircraft, and fired a blistering burst of .50 caliber rounds. The FW-190 shuddered and disintegrated in mid-air, pieces scattering in a fiery arc. The encounter took place so swiftly that some witnesses on the ground later recalled it as a blur. Mustang wheels still retracting as the first enemy fighter went down. Behind Meyer, the other P-51s surged upward, one by one. Their takeoff under fire became a moment of instinct, reaction, and sheer determination. Ground crews watched from trenches and equipment pits as Mustangs sliced through clouds of smoke, climbing hard while German fighters circled the field. Those on the ground had little time to process the spectacle. Luftwaffe pilots continued to rake the airfield in aggressive passes, exploding fuel tanks and tearing into whatever looked valuable. Yet the attackers' early momentum began to waver the instant Mustangs filled the sky above them. The chaos of the next few minutes unfolded across multiple layers of altitude. On the runway and taxiways, maintenance personnel scrambled for cover, dodging debris and tracer rounds. Along the perimeter, American anti-aircraft crews brought their weapons to life, filling the air with streams of fire that forced German attackers into tighter maneuvers. And overhead, the 12 Mustangs began to organize themselves into fighting pairs, rising through the turbulence created by oil smoke and shattered debris. The Luftwaffe had expected an airfield full of grounded aircraft. Instead, the attackers found themselves confronted by a group of pilots already airborne, ready to engage within seconds of takeoff. This unexpected resistance split the German formation's focus. Some fighters continued their assault on the ground. Others attempted to turn skyward to challenge the incoming Mustangs. The shift fractured their cohesion. Meyer's squadron moved through the sky with urgency. Their formation spread out to block escape paths and seize positional advantages. Mustang engines roared as pilots climbed, rolled, and dove into the melee, each motion fueled by instinct and experience. The first engagements unfolded rapidly. One P-51 latched onto the tail of a BF-109 attempting to climb. A burst of gunfire sent shards of metal scattering through the air. Another Mustang pilot dove beneath a strafing fighter, pulled into a tight loop, and reappeared behind the enemy aircraft with lethal precision. Throughout the field, the sense of shock faded, replaced by the controlled aggression of pilots who understood the stakes. The 12 Mustangs that had been moments away from a routine mission shifted seamlessly into combat roles. For every German fighter raking the airfield, another found itself hunted by an aircraft designed explicitly to dominate in the kind of engagement now unfolding over Y-29. On the ground, the scene remained intense and perilous. Fires lit the edges of the airfield, and smoke drifted across the runways in long shadows. Yet among the ground crews, a new sound encouraged them: the unmistakable roar of Mustangs engaging at close quarters. Each sweeping dive overhead signaled that the defense was underway. The initial shock of the German arrival had faded, the counteraction had begun. And as the Mustangs surged higher above the shattered field, the stage was set for the furious battle that would soon define this morning as one of the most remarkable aerial duels of the war. The moment the P-51s cleared the runway, the sky above Y-29 transformed into a maelstrom of twisting aircraft, flashing gunfire, and intersecting trails of exhaust. What had begun as a sudden, violent strike on a vulnerable airfield now evolved into a swirling air battle in which speed, instinct, and composure would decide everything. The 12 Mustangs that had risen through smoke and flame carried the hopes of the entire airfield with them. Above, the Luftwaffe fighters circled in aggressive patterns, expecting to find easy targets. Instead, they found opponents ready to challenge every attack. The first seconds after takeoff set the tone for the entire engagement. The newly airborne Mustangs climbed in tight arcs, consolidating altitude and forming pairs. This elevation, gained under hostile fire, gave them a narrow but decisive advantage. With even a slight height lead, Mustang pilots could dictate the tempo of the engagement. They now had the freedom to dive, choose angles of attack, and intercept enemy fighters trying to reposition for another pass over the airfield. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, already locked into the rhythm of combat, surged forward, scanning the chaotic sky for the next threat. He caught sight of another enemy fighter attempting to break away from its formation. The FW-190 tried to bank sharply toward the tree line, but the Mustang's superior turning capability let Meyer close in immediately. The German aircraft rolled hard in an attempt to shake pursuit, but the Mustang mirrored every movement. The engagement ended in less than a heartbeat when Meyer fired a sustained burst that broke the Focke-Wulf apart. Around him, other Mustang pilots were equally committed. Each maneuver carried the weight of experience gained from missions deep into the heart of Germany. These were men familiar with long-range escort duty, pilot versus pilot duels, and the split-second decisions required when enemy fighters attempted to break into bomber formations. They brought that experience to bear with absolute clarity. Captain William Wisner, one of the group's most skilled pilots, entered the fray with fierce determination. He spotted a cluster of German fighters regrouping to strike through the center of the airfield. Wisner chose a daring approach, cutting directly across their rear flank. His Mustang sliced downward in a steep diving attack, engines roaring as the sight picture stabilized. A precise burst of gunfire engulfed the nearest fighter's tail section. Flames blossomed behind the canopy, and the enemy aircraft spiraled downward. Elsewhere in the sky, 2 Mustangs intercepted a Messerschmitt, attempting to climb for altitude. The German pilot sought the higher horizon to reposition himself, but the upward climb exposed the underside of his aircraft. One of the Mustang pilots rolled inverted and matched the climb through an ascending arc, closing the gap with ease. A stream of .50 caliber rounds carved through the Messerschmitt's wing root, tearing it open. Smoke trailed from the crippled aircraft as it dipped into a powerless descent. Everywhere across the combat zone, pairs of fighters clashed, separated, and found new opponents in a constant rhythm of attack and counterattack. The air reverberated with the echoes of machine gun fire. Shattered fragments from stricken aircraft drifted downward like metallic snow, catching the morning light as they fell toward the frozen fields below. What made the battle remarkable was not just the skill of the Mustang pilots, but the speed at which they imposed control. Their aircraft thrived in this kind of combat. At medium altitude, the P-51 possessed a combination of horsepower, climbing capability, and aerodynamic finesse, unmatched by the German fighters now inside the perimeter. The Merlin engine responded instantly to throttle adjustments. The laminar flow wing kept the aircraft stable through the sharpest turns. Every Mustang in the sky operated as both hunter and defender, able to shift roles in an instant. German fighters attempted coordinated strikes across the edges of the battle, yet each attempt broke apart under Mustang pressure. The Luftwaffe's initial surprise had evaporated. Some enemy pilots tried to disengage and regroup, but retreat proved difficult, with Mustangs positioned across multiple heights. Any attempt to dive away opened opportunities for the Americans to follow through high-speed descents. Efforts to climb into cloud cover faltered under the persistent risk of being intercepted mid-ascent. The Germans soon found themselves fighting on unfavorable terms from every direction. The very timing of their mission turned against them. Operation Bodenplatte had depended on catching Allied aircraft on the ground. Now they were forced to confront the very defenders they hoped to eliminate before the battle even began. It was an inversion of their plan so absolute that the battle could only proceed toward one conclusion. Meanwhile, on the ground, those who had sought cover watched the spectacle unfold above them. Through the roar of engines and crackle of guns, ground crews witnessed the Mustangs carving defensive patterns overhead. Smoke drifted from the burning edges of the airfield, yet a growing sense of hope settled across WWII as more German fighters fell from the sky. Some crewmen later described the sight as a storm passing over, a violent surge that gradually weakened as the Mustangs claimed dominance. Higher into the battle, the Mustangs spread across a wider perimeter. The air was dense with contrails and smoke trails, marking steep climbs and sudden dives. Pilot radios carried short, clipped bursts of communication, warnings, confirmations, quick position calls. Coordination marked every moment of the battle, even amidst its chaos. Captain Alden Rigby, flying with the same flight that had risen behind Meyer, encountered a Bf-109 slipping between formations below him. Rigby rolled into a downward corkscrew and closed distance rapidly. His Mustang stabilized behind the Messerschmitt at the exact moment the German pilot recognized the danger. A desperate attempt at an evasive brake only widened the angle for Rigby. Moments later, sparks erupted across the German fighter's tail, and the aircraft plummeted. In another corner of the combat zone, the Mustangs pressed toward the remnants of the attacking German formation. The initial force that had approached Y-29 with such coordinated precision now struggled to maintain cohesion. Some fighters tried to regroup and mount another attack run on the airfield. Others abandoned the objective entirely and sought escape routes to the east. Yet the Mustangs, freed from the restrictions of runway and altitude, had already established positions that cut off every practical exit. The counterattack swept through multiple phases until the balance of the sky shifted unmistakably toward the Americans. The once crowded airspace thinned as falling aircraft left trails of smoke downward. The battle that had begun with fire sweeping across the airfield now reached its turning point. The P-51s held the sky securely. The Luftwaffe's final concentrated strike had encountered a group of pilots prepared for every angle of the fight. Within this furious engagement lay the essence of the Mustang's combat identity, its speed, resilience, and harmony between pilot and machine. The aircraft excelled in these high-stakes conditions, and the pilots flying them belonged to a generation shaped by grueling missions over hostile territory. That rare combination enabled the P-51s to overwhelm their attackers and secure control of the air above Y-29. By the time the last German fighters attempted to escape the engagement, the outcome was no longer uncertain. The Mustangs had ascended from chaos and carved order from the storm. What followed in the next chapter would reveal the scale of that triumph and the heavy cost the Luftwaffe paid for its final gamble. The final moments of the battle above Y-29 unfolded with the clarity of a conclusion long in motion. What began as a surprise strike had become a contest of skill, discipline, and tactical instinct, and the Mustangs had seized control of every angle. Their ascent from the runway under fire had created momentum that carried into every engagement, and now the sky held unmistakable evidence of that advantage. Smoke trails marked the fall of crippled fighters. Wreckage drifted through winter air. The roar of engines that once shook the airfield softened as the German attack force grew thinner with each minute. Victory, however, isn't merely the absence of opposition. It emerges from the interplay of decisions, capabilities, and the ability to exploit turning points. The Mustang's success over Y-29 stemmed from a sequence of factors that converged with extraordinary precision. The first element was preparation. Though the Luftwaffe aimed to strike at a moment of Allied vulnerability, the presence of Meyer's flight at the end of the runway changed the equation. Those engines already warmed transformed seconds into lifelines. Without that readiness, the German fighters would have possessed an unchallenged opening window, enough time to shred aircraft lined along the dispersal areas. Instead, the P-51s rose into the sky while the attack's opening wave was still forming its strafing passes. The second factor was the skill of the pilots. Many of the American airmen at Y-29 had spent the previous year flying escort missions across Europe. They had chased enemy fighters over long distances, defended bomber formations under relentless pressure, and learned to judge aerial threats within fractions of a second. These experiences sharpened instincts that now guided them through every maneuver. When German fighters attempted to regroup or climb away, the Mustangs were already positioned to intercept. When Luftwaffe pilots tried to dive back toward the tree line, Mustang engines delivered the surge needed to stay on their tails. The Americans responded to each shift in the fight with seamless coordination. The third factor lay in the nature of the German attack force. Bodenplatte had demanded low-altitude flight for long distances through harsh winter air. Those conditions strained engines and narrowed visibility. Furthermore, the navigational complexity of flying at treetop height meant that pilots had little time to react when the unexpected emerged. Even a slight deviation in course altered approach angles to targets. Once the battle above Y-29 ignited, the German formation had trouble maintaining cohesion. Some fighters still committed to striking ground positions, while others switched to defensive maneuvers. The two priorities collided mid-air, fraying the unity required for a sustained assault. Yet none of these factors alone explained the scale of what followed. The heart of the Mustang victory rested in the aircraft's extraordinary performance. The P-51 excelled in exactly the type of combat now unfolding. Its power plant delivered a rapid response at all altitudes. Its airframe held steady through tight turns. Its guns offered both accuracy and sustained fire. And its speed enabled pilots to shift between offense and repositioning with fluid control. With each passing minute, the Mustangs asserted that control more forcefully. Several enemy fighters attempted to stream eastward to break contact, choosing speed over re-engagement. Those efforts collapsed as the P-51s closed distance in steep dives, cutting off escape corridors. Others attempted vertical climbs, seeking to gain enough altitude to reset their position. Those climbs became traps. Each ascent slowed the German aircraft enough for a pursuing Mustang to gain the necessary advantage. Below, ground crews witnessed the tide turn. The sound of incoming strafing faded. Anti-aircraft teams shifted their aim toward isolated stragglers. Smoke that once indicated danger now represented the remains of enemy fighters shot down through the combined efforts of air and ground units. The airfield, though scarred by bullet impacts and lined with small fires, remained operational. Maintenance hangars still stood. Fuel reserves still existed. The attackers had inflicted damage, yet none of it reached the scale planners of Bodenplatte envisioned. Above the field, the Mustangs pressed into the last phase of the battle. Individual duels gave way to short, decisive finishes. One fighter after another descended in a plume of smoke as P-51s swept the engagement zone. A Bf-109, turning into a final defensive spiral, met a burst from a Mustang pressing the advantage. An FW-190, attempting a rapid break toward a patch of forest, fell victim to a perfectly timed intercept from a wingman diving from above. Each of these final confrontations underlined a reality the Luftwaffe could no longer escape. Control of the air over Y-29 belonged entirely to the Americans. Once the final enemy fighters were either destroyed or retreating beyond reach, the Mustangs maintained a wide defensive circuit. Pilots scanned the horizon for any late-arriving formations that might pose new threats. The sky, however, remained clear. The rhythm of the battle slowed. The echoes of gunfire faded. A sense of triumphant exhaustion settled into the Mustang cockpits. What had commenced with chaos now settled into a rare moment of silence across the shattered field. The full weight of the accomplishment reached the ground crews first. Men emerged from trenches, foxholes, and overturned equipment shelters as the last bursts of gunfire vanished from the sky. They looked upward to see Mustangs circling in victorious patterns. Some watched in disbelief, astonished that the field had survived the onslaught. Others took inventory of damage and realized how close the airfield had come to destruction. Wreckage from burning German fighters lay scattered across distant farmland. Smoke still rose from the edges of the runways. Yet the airfield itself remained functional, and the Mustangs that had defended it now returned with combat-proven success. When the P-51s landed, crews rushed toward the returning aircraft. Pilots climbed out with expressions that blended adrenaline, relief, and the dawning recognition of what had occurred. Each Mustang bore the scarring of battle, chipped paint, new bullet holes, and the soot of exhaust streaked across their fuselages. Yet nearly all returned intact, a testament to both the machine and the men who flew it. As details of the encounter spread across the field, a clearer picture appeared. The attacking Luftwaffe group had been severely mauled. Many of the fighters sent toward WWII had failed to return to their bases. The American defenders had turned a strike designed to cripple their air capabilities into a defining victory, one that further weakened an already strained Luftwaffe. This victory mattered far beyond the limits of the field. It reshaped the balance of the air war in the region and affirmed the Allies' command of the skies at a moment when the German ground offensive in the Ardennes still raged. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin in pilots, fuel, and aircraft, absorbed losses it could never replace. The Mustangs had not merely protected an airfield, they had taken one of the last remaining strengths of the German air war and dealt it a decisive blow. That morning sealed the reputation of the P-51 Mustang as the definitive fighter aircraft of the European theater. Its role in the coming days would reinforce that reputation even further, as Allied commands assessed the full consequences of the Luftwaffe's final gamble. Ahead lay the reckoning, an understanding of what Bodenplatte had cost its planners and how the fate of the air war changed forever in the first hours of the new year. The smoke drifting over WWII began to thin as the Mustang squadrons completed their final victory circuits. Down below, the scale of the morning's events slowly revealed itself across the snow-covered field. Fires near the perimeter smoldered in jagged craters. Spent ammunition links lay scattered across runways. The outlines of torn metal glimmered beyond the tree line where shattered German fighters had crashed after their attempts to escape. Although the airfield bore the scars of an intense engagement, its essential structure remained intact, a fact that stunned many who witnessed the full force of the German assault only moments earlier. Ground crews stepped out from their cover, disbelief still painted across their faces. For many, the first sight that grounded the reality of victory was the return of the Mustangs themselves. The aircraft touched down in steady intervals, their wheels kicking up thin sheets of frost as they rolled to their dispersal areas. Despite the violence of the battle, the overwhelming majority of these fighters taxied back under their own power. Each landing reinforced the truth of what had happened. The Luftwaffe's ambush had been reversed into a resounding defeat. The pilots stepped down from their cockpits, with frost clinging to their flight suits, the heat of battle still lingering behind their steady breathing. Some wore expressions of quiet astonishment. Others carried the calm demeanor of professionals who had endured a challenge and prevailed. Ground crews surrounded each aircraft, checking fuel levels, patching damage, and listening to rapid-fire recountings of the morning's engagements. Words jumped between pilots and mechanics, heavy with adrenaline. Many spoke of enemy fighters dropping from the sky. Others described intricate maneuvers that unfolded within seconds after takeoff. The recounting of events grew into a collective mosaic of the extraordinary fight that had just concluded. News of the victory began spreading quickly beyond the airfield. Radio communications connected WWII with nearby command posts, bomber groups, and reconnaissance units. Reports of the German attack circulated rapidly. The scale of Operation Bodenplatte became clearer as more airfields issued status updates. Across Belgium and the Netherlands, numerous Allied bases had been struck almost simultaneously. Ground crews at various stations reported damaged aircraft and temporary disruption, yet the extent of the damage varied greatly. And in one place, at Y-29, the defenders had repelled the attackers with a force that exceeded all expectations. Commanders receiving these reports pieced together the broader implications. The Germans had committed a vast portion of their remaining fighter strength to this coordinated assault. Many of the Luftwaffe units involved were among the last experienced formations still capable of mounting complex operations. The losses they suffered would not be easily replaced. When casualty counts from the battlefield reached analysis rooms, officers realized that Bodenplatte had become a double-edged sword for the Luftwaffe. While the operation had inflicted some damage on Allied airfields, the cost far outweighed any tactical gains. Across the front, dozens of German fighters lay destroyed in fields, forests, and even atop frozen rivers. Pilots who had once fought across Europe now lay captured, wounded, or lost in the wreckage of their aircraft. Within hours of the battle, Allied air commanders recognized that the Luftwaffe's ability to challenge their air superiority had diminished dramatically. The Germans had gambled their remaining strength on a single strike and suffered crippling losses. The Luftwaffe's operational reserves, all that remained after years of attrition, had been thrown into Bodenplatte. The defeat that unfolded at Y-29 was mirrored across multiple airfields, where similar exchanges thinned German air power even further. While analysts assessed the strategic consequences, life at Y-29 shifted into an intense cycle of restoration. Ground crews and engineering teams moved quickly to repair runway damage and extinguish fires. Medical personnel tended to injured airmen and civilians who had suffered in the chaos. Smoke still spread across the airfield in thin streams, yet the hum of activity signaled a return to routine. Aircraft damaged in the attack were pulled aside, rearmed, refueled, and patched where possible. Within hours, some were ready for new missions. This rapid return to capability underscored the resilience of Allied air operations. The industrial strength behind the American war machine meant that airfields could sustain substantial damage without losing operational tempo. Spare parts, replacement aircraft, and replacement crews were available in quantities Germany could no longer match. The Luftwaffe's attempt to reset the balance had collided with the sheer depth of Allied resources. Meanwhile, the psychological impact at Y-29 was profound. The men stationed at the airfield recognized that they had survived an event engineered to eliminate their group entirely. Yet instead of retreating or suffering catastrophic losses, they had executed one of the most effective defensive responses of the entire air war. Their actions became the subject of immediate discussion among higher commands, who noted the extraordinary discipline and skill the pilots displayed in a situation that would have overwhelmed many squadrons. In mess halls, briefing huts, and maintenance pits, conversations continued as the day stretched on. Pilots replayed the engagements in vivid detail, climbing moves executed seconds after wheels left the runway, sudden bursts of gunfire that sent enemy fighters into spirals, moments where smoke obscured the horizon, yet instinct drove them toward optimal firing positions. Ground personnel shared their own accounts, describing the shock of seeing enemy aircraft streak into the field at low altitude, the thunder of strafing runs, and the overwhelming relief when Mustangs soared upward to seize control of the sky. As intelligence reports arrived from other units involved in Bodenplatte, a clearer picture of the operation's failure took shape. Many German fighter wings had suffered catastrophic losses comparable to those inflicted at Y-29. Confusion, navigational errors, and uncoordinated retreat patterns had compounded the Luftwaffe's losses. Some formations had been fired upon by German anti-aircraft units unaware of the operation. Others had been intercepted by Allied fighters before reaching their objectives. The grand design that German planners envisioned had fractured almost immediately upon execution. By evening, analysts concluded that Bodenplatte had cost the Luftwaffe a significant share of its remaining experienced pilots. The fuel consumed in the assault represented months of stockpiling. The aircraft lost could never be replaced at the same pace as Allied production. The German air arm, once fierce and formidable, had crossed a threshold from which recovery was no longer realistic. For the pilots of the 352nd Fighter Group and the airmen stationed at Y-29, The day's events carried a weight that extended into the following weeks. Their victory did not end the war, far from it. Yet it altered the dynamics of air combat along the Western Front. With the Luftwaffe's strength diminished, Allied bomber groups gained an even broader margin of control. Fighter escorts operated with fewer threats. Ground forces advancing through Belgium and into Germany benefited from the increased stability in the skies. The winter had begun with the shock of the Ardennes offensive. Now, through a combination of bravery, preparation, and tactical mastery, the Allies had gained a decisive advantage in the air. The sky that shone cold and pale over Y-29 that morning continued to stretch across the battlefield as an open domain for Allied forces, a domain earned in no small part through the actions of the P-51 Mustang and the men who piloted it through fire and frost. What remained was the larger historical meaning of this event, how a single battle on a frigid airfield in Belgium would echo across the final months of the war and settle into the legacy of the P-51 Mustang. The sun dipped lower across the Belgian countryside as the last traces of smoke drifted away from Y-29. What remained on the airfield was an uneasy stillness, part exhaustion, part reflection. Hours earlier, the sky had echoed with the fury of engines and gunfire. Now it felt like a place transformed. Aircraft rested in their dispersal areas, tools clinked as mechanics resumed their routines, and the ground crews moved with a deliberate calm that follows only after a storm of true magnitude. Word had already started traveling far beyond the field. Something extraordinary had unfolded here. Within Allied command circles, reports from Y-29 arrived in a steady stream. Senior officers pored over after-action summaries that described a scene unlike any other of the European air war. A Luftwaffe force expected to deliver a devastating blow instead met a resistance so fierce that the attackers collapsed in the face of their own momentum. Analysts traced the sequence of events with astonishment. Mustangs launching through gunfire, an aerial counterstrike forming above burning soil, and a coordinated defense that shattered one of the final large-scale German air operations of the war. The reverberations extended even further than immediate military assessments. Newspapers across Allied nations soon picked up fragments of the story. Though wartime censorship filtered specifics, the broader narrative captured public imagination. A small group of fighter pilots had repelled a major enemy strike through raw skill and iron nerves. Veterans of earlier campaigns recognized the significance instantly. The Battle of Y-29 became a symbol of an Allied air force that no longer fought from a position of strain or desperation. The defenders now commanded the skies with unwavering confidence. Inside the 352nd Fighter Group, the mood shifted between pride and contemplation. Pilots who had climbed into the air that morning replayed the engagement in their minds long after leaving their cockpits. Some described moments where instinct and training fused seamlessly, split-second decisions made without conscious thought. Others recalled how the cold air stung their faces as they climbed through the fire-streaked haze above the airfield. Many spoke of the surreal vision of enemy aircraft whipping past just as wheels left the runway, a moment that blurred the boundary between preparation and survival. The stories began forming something greater than individual memories. They became threads in a collective tapestry of a battle where fate, skill, and circumstance intertwined. Among these accounts, the role of Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer stood out prominently. His decision to place the Mustangs on readiness at first light had changed the course of the fight before the first shot was fired. When he engaged the enemy seconds after leaving the ground, that single opening victory set the tempo for the entire squadron. Pilots across the group acknowledged the significance of his leadership, even if few said it openly. Awards soon followed. Meyer received a Distinguished Service Cross for valor, joining an elite cadre of airmen whose actions had shaped pivotal moments in the war. Several other pilots earned Distinguished Flying Crosses and air medals for their contributions during the engagement. These commendations formalized what those on the ground already understood. The performance of the P-51 pilots at Y-29 was not merely courageous, it was historic. Yet the legacy of the battle extended far beyond certificates, ribbons, and citations. It also shaped the identity of the P-51 Mustang itself. solidifying the aircraft's role in the annals of aviation. Before Y-29, the Mustang had already carved out a reputation as an exceptional escort fighter. Its long range, performance profile, and firepower made it indispensable in deep strike missions across Germany. After Y-29, that reputation took on a new dimension. The aircraft was no longer just the guardian of bomber formations, it became emblematic of decisiveness in sudden, overwhelming conflict. Historical accounts later pointed to Y-29 as proof of how preparation and design converged in perfect alignment. The Mustang, with its Merlin engine, high-altitude capability, and aerodynamic elegance, had been engineered for versatility. The battle provided a demonstration that this versatility extended far beyond escort missions. Whether launching under fire, engaging at low altitude, or reclaiming control from a surprise assault, the aircraft responded with a level of reliability that impressed even its most seasoned pilots. In the broader context of the war, Bodenplatte's failure marked a defining moment in the collapse of the Luftwaffe. Analysts later calculated the devastating losses suffered by German units during the operation. Experienced leaders who had survived years of combat were suddenly gone. Wings that once formed the backbone of Germany's air defense returned home with skeletal rosters and battered morale. The German ability to mount coordinated aerial resistance along the Western Front dissolved rapidly after that January morning. In the weeks that followed, Allied air forces enjoyed a freedom of operation rarely seen earlier in the conflict. For the Allies, the psychological impact of Y-29 and the larger failure of Bodenplatte was profound. Ground troops advancing into Germany felt the shift immediately. Columns moved with greater assurance, supply routes encountered fewer disruptions, and the skies remained overwhelmingly friendly. Air crews flying deep penetration bombing missions noticed a drop in intercept attempts. Reconnaissance flights returned with clearer images and fewer losses. The Luftwaffe's demise was not instantaneous, yet its diminishing presence reflected a war turning decisively toward its final arc. Within the 352nd Fighter Group, the legacy of Y-29 lived on in quiet discussions, shared memories, and unspoken bonds. The pilots understood they had experienced something rare, a moment when training, instinct, and sheer timing collided with historic consequence. Many later reflected that they had climbed into their aircraft expecting routine sorties, unaware that they were stepping into one of the most iconic air battles of the European theater. As the months passed, historians, commanders, and veterans returned to the details of Y-29 with growing appreciation. The battle became a case study for military strategists analyzing the interplay between readiness and surprise. Air forces around the world used the encounter to examine how tightly coordinated aerial strikes could unravel when confronting well-prepared, highly skilled defenders. The engagement also offered insights into the importance of adaptability in the heat of combat. Each Mustang pilot who rose into the sky that morning demonstrated the value of assertive, decisive action under extreme pressure. Decades later, the legacy of the legend of Y-29 endures among aviation enthusiasts, historians, and military scholars. Museums feature displays dedicated to the event, highlighting pilot testimonies, combat reports, and aircraft fragments recovered from the battlefield. Some surviving Mustangs have been restored to flying condition and carry paint schemes that honor the 352nd Fighter Group, preserving the memory of the pilots who shaped the battle's outcome. For those who study the war, Y-29 remains more than a tactical victory. It stands as a testament to precision, courage, and the enduring spirit of pilots who rose to meet impossible circumstances. It illustrates how a single moment, 12 Mustangs rolling down a frozen runway into a tempest of enemy fire, can reshape a larger narrative. The outcome of the battle reinforced Allied dominance in the air at a critical stage of the conflict and ensured that the Mustang would be remembered as a fighter that not only influenced the direction of the war, but defined the standard for excellence in aerial combat. As the war moved toward its closing chapters, the memory of January 1st, 1945, remained a powerful reminder of how swiftly the tide of conflict can shift. Y-29 had proven that even when confronted with overwhelming force, a combination of readiness, determination, and technical superiority can turn an ambush into a triumph. In the end, the legacy of the P-51 Mustang at Y-29 isn't simply a record of victory. It is a demonstration of what happens when skill, preparation, and willpower converge.